had a comment on a different video basically asking if fairies were exclusive to or only part of European folklore. And instead of typing out an answer, I wanted to make a video because it's a surprisingly complicated question. It seems like it should have a simple answer, but not really. So, to start, when we're talking about fairies, there is sort of a more modern interpretation of fairies as this very specific twee kind of winged being. But historically, across the last 700 years, the word in English has been used to indicate sort of any other supernatural, otherworldly being who is from a world adjacent to ours, known as the world of fairy, who has what we would describe as magical powers, who can generally look fairly human, but is not, strictly speaking, human. This is kind of the broad definition of what a fairy is. Fairy historically was used synonymously with the word elf, also sometimes with incubus or imp. It's kind of a blurry category. And it has always historically been, at least until very recently, used as a catch-all term. This is all important. So where this gets messy is it is a catch-all term that started in England, in the English language, and was then applied to some culturally specific beings, what we would call the Celtic language-speaking cultures. This includes Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, the Isle of Man, Brittany. We would call these beings fairies in English, but they would be called something different in the native language of that particular area. So in Ireland, yes, you will hear people using the term fairies in English when they are speaking English, but speaking Irish, they would use different terms, and the two are kind of loosely equated. Fairy would be considered the English translation for example, the word is she or shiog. If you look these up in an Irish dictionary, in English, it will give you fairy. This is somewhat of a problem because the English fairy has become increasingly specific to that sort of twee winged, what we might have called a sprite or a sylph a couple hundred years ago. And that is not what the Irish good folk are. But because the same word is used in English, there tends to be this problem where people will assume what they think about the English fairy applies to like the Irish beings. So right here, just to start, you can kind of see where some of these problems in a wider sense are coming in. Because even in places where the word fairy has been in use for hundreds of years as an equivalent to these beings and is just sort of popularly assumed to be a direct equivalent, it actually isn't. Fairy is really not the best translation at this point for those terms. A couple hundred years ago, it would have been a little bit different because fairy was understood differently. It was understood as this catch-all term, which is how it's being used. And so we see a lot of specific types of beings kind of getting lumped into this broad category of fairy. And this is just looking at Ireland, the UK, and northern parts of France that used to originally be Celtic cultural areas. And we're not even looking at all of Europe here, and you can already kind of see where this is getting complicated. There are people in Ireland who I know who really reject using the word fairy for beings like the Ice She, Shioga, Puka even, like anything that would kind of get translated or fall into that wider category of fairy. The argument is to not use the translated term, not use the English word fairy, but to stick to the Irish specific term so that you're not coming in with all of these questionable assumptions. So now you broaden that out to Europe more generally, and the problem continues. So there are certain beings in, for example, Italy or France that would be referred to in English as fairies There are beings in Spain and in Germany that would be referred to in English as elves. Again, with the understanding that originally elf and fairy were kind of equivalent terms. The way that they were used in the older cultures, there wasn't a huge amount of difference between them. It's quite likely that fairy came into the English language in the 1400s as a way to replace the word elf, because it was thought if you say the word elf, it gets their attention and that could be bad for you. So instead you use the term fairy, which comes from the old French word fée, and that's a way to kind of get around it. Then that didn't work, so then the idea of euphemisms, we also see you don't use a specific term or name for them at all. You use these phrases like good neighbors, shining ones, the gentry, things like that, the fair folk, so that if you do get their attention, hopefully it won't offend them, and also maybe will remind them that they potentially can be nice to you. So now we have this case where across Europe, things are being translated into English as fairy from the original terms in those cultures and those languages, and again, losing a lot of nuance. I know it seems like I'm really kind of just grinding on this point, but it's an important foundational concept for answering the actual question. So when we look at the word fairy, even in Europe, particularly Western Europe would be what I'm focusing on here, we can already kind of see that it gets very messy to use the term fairy as an equivalent for whatever being we're looking at. We're already losing the specifics. We're already kind of lumping it in with this English term, which has its own connotations and associations. So now if we broaden this was the question. Are European fairies exclusive to Europe? Are fairies exclusive to Europe, folk belief and folk culture? So the idea of supernatural beings who come from or live in a world adjacent to the human world but have the ability to travel back and forth, beings who tend to be very fond of dairy products, beings who often are averse to iron, not always, but often, beings that have the ability to supernaturally influence humans, often specifically around things like luck and money and health, beings who will sometimes directly interfere with humans, steal them, who can intermarry with them. Not using the term fairy, but just that description, we find those sorts of beings around the globe. I personally have never yet encountered a culture that does not have a spirit being that would check off all or most of these boxes. So just looking at the description and not the specific term, we can find them globally. Every culture is going to have something very similar to these beings. Sometimes they're a kind of demigod, sometimes they're a lesser god. Sometimes they used to be gods, and now that Christianity has come in, they're not anymore. Sometimes they're a different sort of spirit, but one that's very powerful. So all of these things we can kind of find everywhere. The problem tends to come in with the specific use of the word fairy. And this is, again, very messy subject, because most of these cultures, if you go to like Korea and you look up Yojang, and I'm sure I mispronounced that, and I apologize because my Korean's not very good, it will be translated into English as fairy. And this same thing is true in a variety of cultures. When you're translating words, you are looking for the closest equivalent in the second language that matches the word in the first language. And this is never a perfect, or I shouldn't say never, almost never a perfect one-on-one equivalency, but it's sort of the closest you're going to get. So when you look up Yojang in a Korean English dictionary, the translation will be given as fairy. Is that being a fairy? Does it fit that category of descriptions that I listed off a few minutes ago? Yes, they do. Does it fit the stereotypical associations we have in English with a fairy, specifically the post-Victorian, again, twee little winged sprite. No, absolutely not. So that's the problem. If you're using the word fairy in translation, whether you mean to or not, if you're a native English speaker, you're going to make certain assumptions about that being. And this, again, is why even in Irish, people don't always like to use the English translation of fairy, because you lose that nuance, you lose what they actually are within that culture. On the other hand, they do fit that broad category. They are beings who would check a lot of those boxes for how do we identify a being that is a fairy. So that's messy. Now, adding in another layer of complication to this is that a lot of these cultures that I'm talking about have been colonized by the English-speaking world, one way or another, and this includes Ireland. And so there's also oftentimes a real reluctance to use the English term fairy because of that loss of nuance, and because there's this feeling that you're just sort of co-opting a term that's indigenous to a specific place and culture and trying to shoehorn it into this English concept of the word fairy. The language is the problem, basically. If you're talking about, for example, in the United States, various colonized indigenous cultures, if we look at like the Mohegans and the Pequots, they have beings called Mikiawisug. Mikiawisug are small human-like beings who can appear and disappear. You're not supposed to look directly at them because it offends them. But if you're helpful to them or respectful to them, sometimes they can be helpful to you. They are connected to the human natural world, but also seen as not necessarily being entirely part of it. They are spirits. They can appear and disappear and all of that. That word, Mikiawisug, would get translated into English as fairy. It's the closest English equivalent. But you're dealing with indigenous cultures that have been heavily colonized and oftentimes almost destroyed by the anglicized world, particularly England in this example. So not always the best option to call these beings fairies. And I know I'm sounding super semantic because I'm picking on the terminology here, but it's important to understand when you ask the question, do we find fairies outside of European culture or are they exclusive to it? This is such a complicated question for all these reasons that I'm getting into. So a lot of people now do not really like to use the English term fairy specifically for non-European spirit beings. As I said, even in Europe, in some places, this gets a little questionable, but particularly outside of Europe. So what I tend to prefer is to use the term fairy-like. It sort of inherently implies that these are beings that are similar to the English fairies, but it also implies that these are not identical to the English fairies. So they are fairy-like. They are similar to fairies. From that point of view, yes, we have fairy-like beings all around the globe. They are not exclusive in any way to European cultures. Even the ones that appear within European cultures, it's very rarely only found in one super particular culture. Things are messy in general anytime we're talking about fairies. For example, we have the Irish is she. We also have the Scottish she, slightly different spelling because the accent mark is different between the two words, but they're both rooted in Older Irish, so kind of similar. In Ireland, fairies would be translated into English. Is she would be translated in English as fairies. In Scotland, she would be translated sometimes as fairies in dictionaries, but often practically in folklore as elves. We have elves, Elfar in Iceland, who have a lot of similarities and probably basis in Irish is she, just because of the way stuff gets moved around. So there are often not clear-cut delineations between these spirits practically, but they do tend to get associated with specific cultures. They tend to get very specific cultural terms attached to them. So yes, globally, fairy-like spirits. European specific fairies, even if we are using the term fairy for all these Western European spirits, still messy, not just because of the term fairy, but also you do have cultures moving around, interacting and engaging with each other. You have populations moving, you have colonization, you have settlement, you have the famine in Ireland driving a huge number of people out. You have all sorts of reasons why populations move around, and those populations bring their beliefs with them. So you will find older accounts of Irish-specific fairies, Welsh-specific fairies in North America, in Canada, in the United States, in Mexico. In Mexico, they're usually called duende, not fairy, but fairy would kind of be translated into Spanish as duende. One of the options, I should say. I'm not going to have all the Spanish speakers yelling at me in the comments, but you could also translate that as elf or goblin. And there are other words that can more specifically mean like the English type of little winged fairy. I told you it was a messy subject at the start, and it is. It does not get less messy, even trying to explain it. So we have all of these fairy-like spirits found around the globe that have particular cultural understandings, particular names, engagement in specific places. We have that going on. Then we also have all of these populations moving around, bringing their beliefs, bringing their spirits with them. So you can find spirits that would have been more originally understood as indigenous to a specific place, pretty much anywhere around the globe that you have populations moving around. So in the US, you can find all sorts of different kinds of spirits, African, European, Asian, everything kind of gets moved around as populations move. So, like I said, it seems like a simple question. Do we have European fairies outside of Europe, or are they exclusive to that? But it really is not that simple or straightforward. Ultimately, we can answer yes in the sense of fairy-like beings, beings that fit that description, broad description of fairies, can be found everywhere. No, fairy is kind of a word that is exclusive to the English culture and then some related cultures that also primarily speak English. That's the word they're going to use. And also this kind of maybe gray zone in the middle where we have populations settling in new places, potentially bringing their beliefs, bringing their spirits with them, so that we find European-based fairies all over the place, just like we find things from other places all over the place. So that is kind of the ultimate answer to the question. Yes, no, and maybe. A lot of it gets into semantics. A lot of it gets into how comfortable you are or are not using an English language specific term for spirits existing outside of English language speaking cultures. It gets very messy. It stays messy. There is no simple answer to this. But, you know, for people who are curious, yes, no, and maybe. I have written a book specifically on Celtic fairies in North America. So this is a subject I have researched pretty thoroughly for how these things are spread around, how these beliefs are spread around. It's also kind of what's gotten me to a place right now where I give the yes, no, or maybe answer. Yes, the broad definition, those spirits are everywhere. No, it's not really always appropriate to call them fairies, hence why I like the term fairy-like. And that maybe comes in with the, yes, we have beings that were probably originally indigenous to or related to populations that were indigenous to different parts of Europe. But as those populations have moved around, the spirits have moved around as well, and the beliefs have moved around as well. So Do you find European fairies outside of Europe? Yes. Are the concept of fairies, is that exclusive to European belief? No. But the term fairy itself can be really contentious and does require a lot of, I think, consideration before you use it, and an understanding anytime you're using it for beings outside of English specific folk belief. You should always try to look into those nuances and those differences and try to understand how those beings are being perceived and how the folk beliefs are about them in places that are not England, because usually that word is being applied to a being who is not identical to, or even sometimes very similar to, the sort of fairies that we find in English folk belief over the last hundreds of years. And as I mentioned, now in the 21st and 20th century, we have the added complication of the English term fairy no longer really being a catch-all to some people, but being super specific. If you're viewing it as the super specific winged little sprites, then no, that is a much clearer no. We only find those really in English folk belief, and not anywhere else except maybe popular culture influenced things. So I know that was not a neat, concise answer. It's just not a subject that lends itself to that, but I do hope for everyone who stuck it up to the end of the video that this does offer some kind of clarity on why this subject is so complicated. I will also say in academia, I have seen in the last 10 years in particular, sort of a tide change happening where fairy being used as the sort of catch-all term, although it does still have that usage. There is some pushback to it, even in academia, with people arguing for more precision, for not lumping this hugely broad category of spirits into the term fairy, but sort of acknowledging that these are a wide array of different things kind of being pushed together. There is unfortunately no good alternative. The main one that I'll hear suggested in academia and outside of it is just call them spirits. Spirit is such a broad term, it's almost meaningless. I mean, it really is. Like, humans can be spirits. It's kind of like the older Scots word wight, W-I-G-H-T, which just means a being. There's a lot of things that you can apply that to. Humans, animals, fairies, all sorts of things would fall into these super broad categories. So that's not particularly helpful. We really only have in English the word fairy and the word elf to work with, and those now, unfortunately, are no longer really seen as synonyms. In modern culture, in the modern language, they're seen as kind of being very distinct sort of things, even though they weren't historically. So it doesn't leave us with a lot of good options. This is why I tend to use the term fairy-like, because that's about as good as I can get for something to use that is still going to be precise enough so we know what we're talking about, but general enough that we're hopefully not erasing all those nuances. So there we go. Yes, no, and maybe.